Okay, those handouts I gave you just are something so you can read along when we get to that point. We're going to talk about this Cuban Missile Crisis, and we're going to kind of split it up by days. And the whole thing started on October 14th and 15th of 1962. And it actually began on Sunday, October 14th, 1962. And what happened is an Air Force major by the name of Richard Heiser left Edwards Air Force Base in California in his U-2 spy plane. And at 7:31 a.m. he crossed the coastline of Cuba and he photographed the island. It took about 12 minutes of photography of the island on that day. He lands in southern Florida and he turns the film over to members of the CIA. And by Monday, October 15th, the photographs are developed in Washington, D.C. and, as you probably know, produced some pretty shocking results. Several men studied the photographs, including a fellow by the name of Michael Davis. And Davis reported that the photographs clearly showed long circular objects that measured somewhere between 65 feet and 100 feet in length. Another one of the men who studied the photographs was Dino Bruganoni, and he was the man that determined that those objects in the photos were Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles, and he also determined that the range of these missiles would be about 2,000 miles. They all had the capability of going about 2,000 miles. Well, a guy by the name of Art Lundell, who is the director of the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C., was the next fellow to study the photographs. And when he looked at the photographs, he said to both Davis and Bruganoni, he said, "This is trouble, real trouble." So when we move on to Tuesday, October 16th, that was the official day of what we know as the 13 days in October that we talk about concerning the Cuban Missile Crisis. And at 9 o'clock in the morning, President Kennedy called his brother Bobby and asked him to come to the White House. Bobby arrived and the president filled in his brother with the early information he had received about those photographs. And President Kennedy also informed Bobby that there would be an official briefing by the CIA. At 11:45 a.m., this fellow right here, Marshall Carter, this guy right here, he was the man that briefed the president. He gave a formal presentation to President Kennedy and several members of his Kennedy cabinet. And Marshall Carter also informed President Kennedy about the presence of missiles and missile launching pads in Cuba. Well, everybody that was involved in the discussion knew that the United States was in great danger and seeking to explore options on what to do about the problem in Cuba. President Kennedy organized a committee, and this committee would be consisted of members of his cabinet, selected leaders of the United States military, and other governmental, influential government leaders that might shed some expertise on the subject. And this committee would be officially called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, better known in American history as EXCOM. They never really referred to it anything other than EXCOM. And again, it was the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. So members of EXCOM, Kennedy had a Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, on that committee. The Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, was on the committee. Secretary of the Treasury, C. Douglas Dillon, was on the committee. The Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, was on the committee. Robert Kennedy, Attorney General, was on the committee. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy. CIA Director John McCone. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations was Adlai Stevenson, and he was a very promising politician, and he's going to play a key role in this thing later on. Presidential speechwriter and advisor Theodore Sorensen was on the committee. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Maxwell Taylor, was on the committee. The Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, General Curtis LeMay, was on the committee. The commander of the U.S. Tactical Air Command, General Walter Sweeney, was on the committee. Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral George W. Anderson, Jr., was on the committee. And they brought in a guy by the name of Dean Acheson, who was the former Secretary of State under President Truman. And they wanted some people with some experience in dealing with the Russians. And he was kind of an old hardliner, an old hat guy, and they brought him in also. And another person they brought in was Kennedy's appointment secretary, Kenneth O'Donnell. And Kenneth O'Donnell was a key part of this committee because he had the president's ear and the president would really listen to him. He was simply a close advisor and was the appointment secretary, which position-wise wasn't too much, you know what I mean? Well, anyway, later in the day, After a lengthy discussion, ExComm came up with a possible option to deal with the crisis in Cuba, and that was the option of military force. The United States would launch airstrikes upon the island of Cuba and then follow that with invasion. Now, during the time this particular option was being discussed, President Kennedy received more news concerning Cuba. They cited 25 merchant ships that were heading toward Cuba, and it was the belief of ExComm that these merchant ships had a high likelihood of carrying missiles to Cuba, not probably goods. And so Kennedy was scheduled to visit Connecticut on Wednesday, and he wanted to cancel that because of the crisis, and both Bobby and Kenneth O'Donnell convinced him to go on as normal because it was crucial that the news of this crisis didn't get out into the American press. And so they said, no, you're going to go to Connecticut, you're not going to do anything different. Well, on Wednesday, October 17th, the second day of the crisis, before he departed for Connecticut, he attended a breakfast service at St. Matthew's Cathedral. He met with the Crown Prince of Libya, and then he boarded Air Force One for Connecticut. Now, during the president's absence, ExComm met to discuss other possible options rather than airstrikes followed by invasion. And Bobby Kennedy didn't like that option because he saw that as a sneak attack by the United States upon a much smaller country, and that would be very unpopular around the world, especially with the United Nations. So, the military is really pressuring for these airstrikes and invasion. And finally, Bobby turns to Secretary of Defense Bob McNamara and he says, Bob, if we go ahead with these airstrikes, you know what it'll come to in the end. There's got to be something else. Give it to me. So he turns to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and says, what can we do other than invade or airstrikes followed by invasion? Well, McNamara responded with a scenario that they had developed before in this situation, which called for a naval blockade of all ships into Cuba. And after his Connecticut appearance, Kennedy returned to Washington, D.C. to resume discussions with ExComm the next day about the crisis in Cuba. So the main point of that day was to have the president go on his trip, act as normal, and ExComm try to come up with a solution other than airstrikes and invasion. Well, on Thursday, October 18th, President Kennedy was scheduled to meet with ExComm that morning. And prior to the meeting, the president was given new information from more spy photos that were taken on a more recent spy plane mission over Cuba. And these new photos showed the possibility as many as 40 missiles on the ground already in Cuba. And the missiles had a longer range ability that the first missiles had cited. These new missiles would have the ability to reach every major city in the United States from Cuba with the exception of Seattle. That was the only city that would not be reached by these missiles. Well, during the meeting, Air Force General Curtis LeMay, who was quite a character, briefed President Kennedy, and he gave his recommendation on what ought to be done with these missiles in Cuba. Now, of course, LeMay's recommendation would be an immediate airstrike on Cuba, and he strongly believed that those missile sites had to be destroyed before they became operational. Now, to explain that, these missiles were on the deck, right, on the ground, ready to go, but the missile sites that would launch these missiles were not operational. In other words, they did not have the capability to launch the missiles yet. And so LeMay's point is, we've got to airstrike these, and we've got to invade before these launching pads get operational, because once they get operational, we lose control. And anyway, he comments to President Kennedy, and he was kind of a gruff guy, and he says, all you got to do is say go, and my boys will get those red bastards. And yeah, that's him.
Cigar smoking.
Yeah. Well, President Kennedy asked LeMay if he really thought that was the best course of action. He said, do you think that's our best course of action? And LeMay responded by saying, Mr. President, I believe this is our only course of action. America is in danger. The big red dog is digging in our backyard, and we are justified in shooting him. And sir, given your own statements about Cuba, I think a blockade or a bunch of political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as a pretty weak response. I suspect many of our own citizens would feel the same way. You're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President. Well, President Kennedy didn't particularly like that, and he snapped back and he said, what did you say? And LeMay repeated himself, and President Kennedy ended the conversation with LeMay by saying, well, maybe you haven't noticed, but you're in it with me. So it was kind of interesting. Well, Kennedy continued to talk to LeMay, and he says, what do you think Russia's response is going to be Russia's response if we attack Cuba? And LeMay simply said nothing. And President Kennedy reiterated, he says, what do you mean nothing? And this is an interesting statement. LeMay says nothing because the only alternative open to them is one they can't choose. And despite LeMay's comments, President Kennedy said, quote, if we kill Soviet soldiers, they're going to respond, because there were Soviet soldiers on the ground in Cuba. I mean, how would we respond? If they're going to do something, General, I will promise you that. Well, Kennedy was concerned that if we airstruck Cuba and invaded, they would retaliate by trying to take Berlin. And we weren't going to give Berlin up under any circumstances. And basically, if we had to be forced to defend the people of West Berlin, the possibility of nuclear war was greater. And so Kennedy's trying to use, his head here and try not to get himself in a jam right away, because he believes strongly that if the United States throws airstrikes at Cuba and follows with invasion, the Soviet Union won't rush to Cuba, they'll rush to Berlin. And they'll try to take Berlin, and then we would be forced to protect Berlin, and there goes the whole story. So, well, after listening to the military's recommendations, President Kennedy thanked the committee and excused himself into his office. And Bobby Kennedy and Kenneth O'Donnell joined the president to continue to evaluate the situation on their own. Well, the members of the military, General LeMay, General Taylor, and especially former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, they left the meeting very bewildered and very angry. They expected President Kennedy to give them permission for airstrikes followed by invasion, and he was not prepared to do that. Well, this is kind of an interesting story too, because later that afternoon, President Kennedy had already been scheduled to meet with Soviet diplomat Andrei Gromyko. It was already set up, and Gromyko did not know that the United States knew anything about these missile sightings. And so the two men sat in the Oval Office, and several things were discussed, and diplomat Gromyko suggested that the United States should quit threatening Cuba. Well, President Kennedy took that opportunity, and he expressed his concern about any possibility that the Soviet Union would be supplying Cuba with offensive weapons. He basically confronts Gromyko about that, and Gromyko states that the Soviet Union would only supply Cuba with non-military assistance. And Gromyko then went on to emphasize that the Soviet Union would never become involved in furnishing of offensive weapons to Cuba. Well, although President Kennedy knew Gromyko was not telling the truth, he kind of tried to keep a straight face, and it was very important because he didn't want Gromyko to know that the United States were already aware of the missiles in Cuba and missiles probably en route on those Soviet merchant ships. So Kennedy continued his discussion and basically said a couple of times, now, so we're perfectly clear here, the United States could not stand for the Soviet Union placing any kind of missiles in Cuba. And Gromyko assured the president that would never happen, and the sole objective of the Soviet Union was simply to, quote, give bread to Cuba in order to prevent hunger in that country. Well, Kennedy repeated himself again about the missiles in Cuba to assure that there was no misunderstanding on the part of Gromyko, that you understand that the United States could never stand for any offensive missiles into Cuba. And Gromyko again assured Kennedy he understood, said goodbye, left the White House. Well, basically Gromyko officially denied that any missiles were in Cuba or were arriving on merchant ships, and the President Kennedy was quite upset after that meeting. He believed that Gromyko had purposely lied to his face, and he did, basically did, unless Gromyko didn't know anything about the missiles, which is highly unlikely. Well, the President then met privately in his office again with Bobby Kennedy and Kenneth O'Donnell, who really are the two closest advisors he has during the crisis. And he was scheduled to campaign to Chicago on that Friday and Saturday, and again he wanted to cancel the trip because of the crisis. Well, both Bobby Kennedy and Kenneth O'Donnell convinced him to go on as normal. It was crucial that the news of the crisis not get to the press. Besides, Mayor Richard Daley was expecting the president. Now, you guys know anything about Richard Daley in Chicago?
He's the Democratic machine.
What's that?
He's the Democratic machine.
Plus, he might have had some ties to the mob. Oh yeah. Well, and well, the rumor was, that Mayor Daley had given Kennedy a lot of quote help during the campaign in the election of 1960 because, Illinois was a very close vote there in a big state. And O'Donnell decided to tease the president a little bit, saying, "Oh, you're afraid to cancel on Daley," and and the president says, well, I'm not afraid to cancel on Daly. And finally, he looks at Kenny and he says, are you afraid to cancel on Daly? And he says, you're damn right. You don't cancel on Daly. Anyway, he kind of gave him a little bit of a joke there. Well, anyway, before Kennedy left for Chicago, he insisted that Bobby get a consensus from the ExComm committee on either a blockade or airstrikes. He wanted to get a consensus. What does the committee want to do? And the president emphasized to his brother that he needed this consensus by Saturday at the latest, and he wanted no split among the committee. He wanted a unanimous decision, because a split in the committee would show the weakness to the Soviet Union once they became aware of what the Soviet Union was going to do. So he wanted everything in line. He wanted that committee to come up with the recommendation and total consensus. Well, on Friday, October 19th, Kennedy left early in the morning for his trip to Chicago, and he took Kenneth O'Donnell with him. And as President Kennedy was spending the day with Mayor Daley, Bobby called and visited with Kenneth O'Donnell and said, hey, I've got a consensus for a blockade from ExComm, but it isn't going to last the day. In other words, the military was continuing to push for invasion, and he thought he might lose that consensus by the end of the day. So Bobby told O'Donnell that President Kennedy had to get back to Washington, D.C. as soon as possible before some members of ExComm changed their mind from blockade to invasion. Well, to make this work, Kenneth O'Donnell went to Press Secretary Pierre Salinger and told Salinger that the president had developed a cold and needed to return to D.C. on the advice of his doctor. Well, Salinger is a press secretary, but they didn't tell him. He didn't know what was going on. He had no idea of the missiles in Cuba or anything. And he didn't know anything about the crisis. And he got kind of frustrated. And he stated to Kenneth O'Donnell, hey, Kenny, do I get any input around here? And O'Donnell looked at him and says, yeah, you can decide how bad the cold is. That was his input. So Salinger announces to the press that the president would be canceling the rest of his visit to Chicago and returning to Washington, D.C. on the advice of his doctor. And he did. Well, Saturday, October 20th comes about, and after his return from Chicago, President Kennedy met with ExComm and studied his options again. And the committee, after hours of deliberation, recommended a blockade of all ships into Cuba. And Defense Secretary McNamara made it clear that the operation be called a quarantine rather than a blockade, because when he explained to the committee that a blockade would be seen as an act of war and a quarantine would not. So he didn't want the term blockade used anymore. He wanted the term quarantine. McNamara then explained the procedure that would be used for the quarantine once it was officially put into action for ships en route to Cuba. Remember, those ships were heading. Here's kind of how it was supposed to work. This was the procedure. The United States Navy would stop any Soviet ship that was 800 miles up from the quarantine line. So they actually are going to draw a line in the water, so to speak, and they're going to stop any Soviet ship that's within 800 miles of that line. Once they stopped the ship would be boarded and inspected, and if the vessel was carrying weapons, it would be simply ordered back. That was the procedure. Well, McNamara further stated that the quarantine would stop any missiles from entering Cuba, but what doesn't it solve? The existing missiles in Cuba. And the hope was that the quarantine would convince the Soviet Union into voluntarily removing their missiles in Cuba to prevent war with the United States. So, although the quarantine line wasn't going to get them out of, wasn't going to solve the problem with the missiles in Cuba, once they stopped them and understood that, hey, the jig's up, we know what's going on here, that they would voluntarily take them out. Now, as a safeguard, McNamara stated to the committee to kind of make over to the military that if the Soviets refused to remove the missiles, then we would still have the option of airstrikes. So airstrikes was not a question, but we'd rather they voluntarily take them out. Well, at this point, CIA Director John McCone really voiced his opposition to the quarantine. He believed the blockade would eliminate America's first strike capability, the element of surprise, and it certainly would have. He had a point. And he stated that if the Soviet Union sensed that the United States was going to invade Cuba, they would maybe skip the Berlin scenario and they would launch their missiles from Cuba, getting kind of a use them or lose them philosophy. So what he's saying is, we can't do this blockade. If we do this blockade and they know we know what's going on in Cuba, we lose any first strike capability. We lose the element of surprise. And if we lose the element of surprise, these guys won't worry about Berlin. They'll just launch their missiles that are ready to go in Cuba, and they'll have first strike ability. So that was his big concern. Well, Well, this is kind of an interesting part of the lecture because here comes Adlai Stevenson. Now, if you know anything about him, very soft-spoken man, he listens to discussion back and forth, and finally Adlai Stevenson says, well, maybe one of us in this room should be a coward, so I guess it'll be me. And he proposes a third option to strike a deal with the Soviets. And he suggests this: we will trade with Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, which was an American possession in Cuba, and give up the Jupiter missiles that we already had in Turkey, which were in the Soviet Union's backyard, in exchange for the Soviets removing their missiles in Cuba. So Adlai Stevenson sets up there, he's trying to cool the military down, he's trying to come up with a compromise, and he says, hey, why don't we propose a third option? Why don't we strike a deal with the Soviets? We'll give them Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, which was an American possession, and our Jupiter missiles will remove those in Turkey, and they'll promise to take theirs out of Cuba. Well, President Kennedy listened respectfully to the elder statesman, but quietly stated that that was not possible. That was not something they could do. It would even show further weakness, and they didn't want to negotiate with the Soviets. So President Kennedy informed the committee that he would take time to explore these options, and he'd make a decision on the situation in Cuba, and he would give his decision to the American people on Monday night on national television with full disclosure to citizens of the United States on the situation in Cuba. So he's going to make it public Monday night what they're going to do. He doesn't feel like he can keep it a secret any longer. Does that make sense? Well, anyway, the president asked Ted Sorensen, his speechwriter, to prepare 2 speeches for his national television appearance on Monday night, a speech with the use of the naval blockade, and a speech to explain the airstrikes that would be followed by invasion. And the president concluded the meeting that day by thanking the committee for all their advice. And then later that evening, they were all scheduled to be at a dinner party, and Adlai Stevenson struck up a conversation with Kenneth O'Donnell, and Stevenson informed O'Donnell that the New York Times was prepared to run a story about the situation in Cuba in Sunday morning's paper. They're not supposed to know anything about it.